She was 22 years old, and she had, in the most clerical and bloodless way imaginable, just become a person with nowhere to go. We want to tell you about Rosamund Keel tonight, not because her story ends with triumph over great odds, though it does, but because it begins with something smaller and harder than that. A Tuesday morning, a thin envelope, and a decision made in the space of a held breath that would determine the entire shape of the life that followed. Settle in. We're glad you're here. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Rosamund Keel, Rose to the few people who had ever bothered to know her well, was born in the mill town of Wharton, in the near north of Ontario, in the hard winter of 1878. Her father, Ellis Keel, was a millwright of considerable skill and quiet reputation. He was not a man who talked much about his work, but he was a man who did it with a kind of absorbed reverence that Rose learned to recognize early. He could read the behavior of water the way other men read weather. He understood the language of gears and shafts and load-bearing timbers, and he believed, sincerely, stubbornly, that there was no mechanical problem on earth that could not be solved with patience, the right measurement, and a willingness to begin again. What he gave her, before his lungs gave out in the damp spring of her 9th year, was the shape of how to look at the world. Everything has a true angle, Rose, he used to tell her, crouching over the workbench in his small workshop while she watched. Find the true angle and everything else falls into place. And he gave her something else. A tool he had carried for 30 years, a millwright's adjustable bevel gauge, the body worn brass bright from use, the blade still precise after decades of work. It fit in the palm of her hand. When he died, her mother pressed it into her keeping as the last true thing that had belonged to him. Her mother lasted 2 more years. Then Rose was sent to live with her father's cousin, Rufus Drace, a timber merchant, who operated out of a large, gloomy house on the east side of Wharton. Rufus Drace was a man who kept careful accounts. He was not unkind in any dramatic sense. He never raised his voice, never deliberately humiliated her. But he understood the world as a series of assets and liabilities, and he had taken in his dead cousin's orphaned daughter as a matter of family obligation, not affection. She was fed and housed. In return, she worked. By the time she was 12, she was managing the household ledgers. By 14, she could reconcile the timber tallies faster than his office clerk. By 16, she was handling correspondence with 3 of Rufus Drace's smaller clients, none of whom knew they were writing to a girl. She was not sent to school beyond her earliest years. There was no formal arrangement for her wages. There was the understanding, never spoken aloud, which made it harder to challenge, that her keep was payment enough for what she contributed, and that she ought to be grateful. The one person in that house who treated her with simple, uncomplicated decency was old Cormac Webb, the firm's warehouse manager, a widower who had worked for Rufus Drace's father before Rufus took over. Cormac Webb was a man of few words and steady hands, and he saw in Rose what she could not yet see in herself. On Saturday afternoons, when the warehouse was quiet, he taught her things that were not in ledgers: how to read the grain of a timber beam, how to set a mortise properly, how to judge the soundness of a floor joist by the way it flexed under weight. He never said these lessons were gifts, but they were. He died in the autumn of her 18th year, of a stroke that came without warning on a Wednesday afternoon. After that, she was truly alone in the Drace household, a competent fixture, invisible in the way that useful things become invisible. The end came 4 years later, on that unremarkable Tuesday morning. Rufus Drace called her from the kitchen accounts into his study. He did not ask her to sit. He stood behind his large oak desk. He was a man who was always behind something large and oak, and informed her of several things in the order of their importance to him. His eldest son, Barrett, was to be married in the spring. Barrett's new wife came from a family with her own capable household staff. The arrangement at the Drace house would be restructured accordingly. Roz's role as bookkeeper and household manager was, he explained, being consolidated. He slid an envelope across the desk. Her father's estate, he said, had included a small insurance policy. He had been managing it on her behalf as was proper. Deducting reasonable administrative costs and the value of her board over the years, the remaining balance came to $41. He had added to this a sum he considered a fair settlement for her most recent years of direct service, $53. The total was $94. He felt this was generous. He did not say he was sorry. There was nothing in his face that suggested he had considered whether he ought to be. Roz stood very still for a moment. She was thinking, with a peculiar clarity, of something her father had told her once. That a level is only useful if you trust the bubble. If you already know which way you want the surface to tilt, you will tilt the level to match and call it true. What Rufus Drace had done for 13 years was tilt the level. She had always known it. She had simply been waiting for the bubble to settle enough to prove it. She picked up the envelope. She thanked him, not warmly but correctly, and she left. She spent that afternoon packing. Her possessions were not numerous. A change of clothes. A wool blanket that had been Cormac Webb's. She had kept it when they cleared his room, because no one else had wanted it. A folding knife. A small notebook of measurements and working notes she had accumulated over the years. And the bevel gauge, wrapped in a square of flannel, tucked into the inside pocket of her coat, where it had always lived. The next morning, before the household was fully awake, she walked out the back door of the Drace house and turned east along the old Pinecroft Spur. The Pinecroft Spur was what remained of a narrow-gauge logging railway that had served 3 timber camps in the bush north of Wharton before the last mill closed 15 years ago. The rails were still there. The company had gone bankrupt before it could afford to pull them up for scrap. But the line hadn't carried freight since before Rose was old enough to remember it working. Most of Wharton's current residents had never followed it far enough to see where it ended. Local wisdom held that it ended at a collapsed trestle and a stand of second-growth poplar, and that was all. The land office in Wharton was a single-room building beside the registry, staffed by a clerk named Doyle. A man of middle age with ink-stained cuffs and the particular satisfaction of someone who controls access to something other people need. He looked up when she came in. He did not stand. She told him she was looking for available parcels. What did they have, and at what prices? She did not mention how much money she had. She had learned something from the previous morning. When a man knows your resources, he prices to match them. Doyle showed her the wall map without enthusiasm. The good parcels, the ones with road access, standing timber, reliable water, had long since been taken up by the larger operators. What remained was a list of residuals: rock outcrop, muskeg, a creek bottom that flooded twice a year. Then his finger stopped at a notation in the northeast quadrant of the map. An old mill site, he said, in a tone, suggesting this was more information than she deserved. 8 acres on a creek. The mill building had come down in a spring flood 6 years back, and only the old millwright station remained standing. The creek itself had shifted channel after the dam washed out, which was why it no longer appeared on the current survey sheets. The parcel had been on the books for 11 years. No takers. "What is the price?" she said. He told her. $93.50 with filing. She looked at the map. She saw the faint line of the Pinecroft Spur threading northeast into the bush. She saw the small mark indicating the mill site, an island of notation in otherwise empty parchment. It was nothing. And simultaneously, in a way she couldn't have explained to Doyle if she had tried, it was exactly something. Before she answered, she went next door to the bakehouse and spent 30 cents on a meat pie, which she ate on the front step in the thin April sunlight. It was the first hot food she had eaten in 2 days, and she intended to make a habit of feeding herself before she spent money on anything else. Then she went back inside. "I'll take it," she said. Doyle's eyebrows moved slightly. He shrugged, pulled out the deed file, and began the paperwork. An hour later, Rosamund Keel walked out of the land office with the deed to Lot 12 of the Pinecroft Mill survey in one coat pocket and 60 cents in the other. She was a landowner now. She had a place on a map, or rather, she had a place that had been removed from the map, which she was beginning to understand might be an advantage. She reached the mill site 2 days later, following the spur northeast into country that grew quieter and denser with every mile. The railway right-of-way narrowed as the trees pressed in on either side, birch and poplar giving way to older spruce and balsam, the rails rusting to the same red-brown as the fallen needles underfoot. The mill site was exactly as described and worse. The main building had collapsed inward, the roof first, then the walls, and what remained was a slumping mound of gray timber half buried in the undergrowth. The mill pond was silted over. The wooden dam had rotted down to a few dark posts. The creek had indeed moved, curving 30 feet to the east in a new channel through clean gravel, as if it had simply decided to find a better route. But the millwright's station was standing. It was a small stone building, no larger than a generous pantry, set back from the main structure on higher ground. The walls were fieldstone, set in lime mortar that had held through everything. The roof was intact. The door was warped in its frame, but she got it open with her shoulder, and inside the air was cold and dry and smelled of dust and old iron. There was a small hearth at one end, a wooden shelf along one wall, a ring bolt in the floor for securing a chain hoist, and in the hearth, a flat slab of smooth granite that served as the hearthstone. Laid there for practical reasons, Rose knew, because millwrights were always working near water and fire and needed a stable, non-combustible surface underfoot. She slept on the floor. That first night, the old blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. It was on the second morning, clearing the ash from the hearth to check the flue, that she noticed the granite slab was not mortared in place. When she pressed on one corner with her boot, it rocked slightly. She used her knife blade to work into the seam. The slab was heavy. She needed the knife as a lever, both hands on the handle, leaning her full weight until the stone grated and shifted and lifted. Beneath it was a hollow, neatly excavated, the walls lined with flat stones to keep it dry, and inside, wrapped in 2 layers of oilskin tied with copper wire, was a tin box roughly the size of a small bread loaf. Her hands were steady as she lifted it. It was heavier than she expected. She unwrapped it carefully. The oilskin was stiff but unbroken, and when she worked open the lid, the interior was dry and clean. A faint smell of cedar rose from inside, from a small block of wood tucked into one corner. Put there as a desiccant, she understood immediately, to absorb any moisture that might otherwise ruin what was stored here. It was a millwright's solution, practical and quiet and effective. On top lay a rolled document tied with twine. Beside it, wrapped in flannel, was a bundle of currency, Dominion of Canada notes, folded flat and stacked with care. She did not count it yet. She set it aside and picked up the roll. She untied the twine and spread the document carefully on the floor, weighting the corners with stones from the hearth. It was a technical drawing, detailed and precise, executed in a draftsman's hand that knew exactly what it was drawing. A small water wheel, horizontal axis, suited to a low head of water. Beside the main elevation were cross-sections showing the gear train that would transfer power from the wheel shaft to a drive shaft above. In the margin, a notation, suitable for 18-inch fall, 40 CFM flow. This creek can do it. And beneath the drawing, folded separately, a letter. She sat on the floor, the letter in her hands, and read, "To whoever opens this box. My name is Henrik Vorn. I was the millwright at Pinecroft for 11 years, from the time the company laid the first rails until the day it went bankrupt and walked away without a word to anyone. I stayed for 2 more seasons after the others left, thinking someone would come to make it right. No one came. When I finally left, I took nothing that wasn't mine except the memory of this place and what remained of the wages the company owed me, which I had stopped hoping they would pay. The drawing in this box is a wheel I designed the winter before the end. The creek is not dead. It never was. It moved, is all, and it is better where it moved to. That new channel has a fall of 22 inches over 10 yards, which is better than what we had before. A wheel built to these plans, set in the right place, will run. I know it will because I surveyed the new channel myself before I packed my tools. I am leaving this money here because I have no family to leave it to, and because I believe that whoever eventually opens this box is the right person to use it. You found this place. You chose it when no one else would. That tells me something about the kind of person you are. Use it to build something that will last. If you need skilled hands or cannot get what you need from the town, follow the spur north from here, past the second trestle. It will take you into a valley. There you will find a settlement called Pinecroft Station. It is not on any government map. The people there made a point of ensuring that, after what the company did to them. They do not trust strangers easily, but they are good people. Tell them Henrik Vorn sent you. They will understand. I hope this place treats you better than it was treated. Henrik Vorn, Millwright, October 1895. Rose read the letter twice, then a third time, more slowly. The way she had learned to reread drawings when the dimensions were important, and she wanted to be certain she had understood them. She sat for a long while after that. The stone walls of the small room were the kind her father would have recognized immediately, built by someone who knew what permanence required, who understood that the purpose of foundations was not to be admired, but to be relied upon. She counted the money then. It came to $360, more than 3 years' wages for most working people in the district. She looked at the bevel gauge in her hand. She had taken it from her pocket while she read, the way she always did when she was thinking through a problem. Her father had taught her to find true angles. Henrik Vorn, a man she had never met and might never find, had left her a wheel designed for the exact creek that ran 20 feet from where she sat. Two men, one known to her since birth and gone since childhood, one a complete stranger. Both of them had cared about a future they could not see. She put the letter and the drawing back into the tin. She put the money in her inside coat pocket, beside the bevel gauge, and she went outside to look at the new channel of the creek, running clear and cold over the gravel, and she began to measure the fall. The walk back to Wharton took a full day. She arrived in the late afternoon and went directly to the cookhouse near the rail depot, where she spent 40 cents on a proper supper and sat at a table by the window and ate every bite of it. She had made herself a rule: food first, always, before any other purchase. Then she took out her notebook and reviewed her list. She did not go to the land office. She went instead to the hardware merchant on Timber Street and worked through what she needed: a good crosscut saw, stone chisels, a brace and bit set, a plumb bob, galvanized hardware for wheel bearings in the sizes Henrik Vorn had specified in his margins, oakum for sealing, and 2 good whetstones. She paid in smaller bills from the money, keeping nothing back that she would need, spending nothing on anything she wouldn't. She did not lay her money on the counter. She named each item and paid as she went. For transport, a woman at the counter recommended a freighter named Saul Parr, who worked out of the livery at the end of the block. Saul Parr was a man of perhaps 65, lean and weathered, with the look of someone who had spent most of his adult life outdoors, without making much of a fuss about it. He listened to her, described the job without changing his expression. Then he looked at her slight frame, and her worn coat, and the list in her notebook, and a skeptical crease appeared between his eyebrows. "That is a long haul on a bad track," he said. She met his gaze directly. "I know the track," she said. "I walked it 2 days ago. The second trestle wants attention, but it will hold a loaded wagon, and the land is mine. I intend to put it to use." She named a price for the hauling that was fair, and showed she understood what the work was worth. Something in his expression shifted. He spat into the dirt and gave a slow nod. "First light," he said. "Be ready." Saul Parr's wagon reached the mill site by noon the following day. He helped her unload without comment, his movements economical and unhurried. Before he left, he stood for a moment looking at the new channel of the creek, at the granite riffle where the fall was sharpest. "You are going to put a wheel in there," he said. It was not quite a question. She unfolded Henrik Vorn's drawing and held it up without a word. Saul Parr studied it for a long time. Then he said, "That is good work, that drawing." He touched the brim of his hat and turned the team back toward town. The weeks that followed were the hardest physical work of her life, and the most purposeful she had ever felt. She poured the wheel housing footings from fieldstone and lime slurry, the same method Henrik Vorn had described, the same method her father would have used. She shaped the wheel spokes and paddles from the green oak lumber Saul Parr had hauled out, using the bevel gauge at every joint to find true angles, hearing her father's voice in some quiet part of her mind as she worked. "Everything has a true angle, Rose. Find it, and the rest falls into place." She got the frame standing on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after she had arrived at the site. She was alone when it happened. There was no one to tell. She stood and looked at it for a while, and then she went back to work. A week later, she followed the second part of Henrik Vorn's letter north, along the spur. Past the first trestle, which she crossed carefully, testing each timber, the bush grew denser and the right-of-way narrowed until it was barely more than a footpath. After the second trestle, the land began to drop into a shallow valley, and then she was through a stand of old cedar and into something she had not anticipated. The valley was green in a way that felt disproportionate to everything surrounding it. A creek ran through it, fed by springs, and along that creek there were gardens, large and well-tended, with raised beds and cold frames and careful trellising. A dozen buildings stood back from the water. Log construction, chink-tight, with good roofs and stone chimneys. She could hear a hammer somewhere to the north. She could smell wood smoke and something baking. Her arrival was noticed before she cleared the tree line. By the time she reached the nearest building, there were 4 people visible who had not been visible a moment before. All of them watching her with the particular attention of people who have learned that unannounced strangers are rarely good news. An older woman came forward from the group. She moved with deliberate authority, not hurrying, not yielding. Her hair was silver, her face mapped with the kind of lines that come from decades of outdoor work. She stopped 10 feet from Rose. "This is private land," she said. "State your business." Ross had thought carefully about what to say on the long walk up. "My name is Rosamund Keel," she said. "I've taken ownership of the old Pinecroft mill site down the Spur. I was cleaning out the millwright station, and I found a letter under the hearthstone from a man named Henrik Vorn. He told me this place existed, and he said to tell you he sent me." The silence that followed was long enough that she counted her own heartbeats. Then the woman's expression changed, not to warmth exactly, but to something more complicated, recognition, and beneath it, a grief that had clearly been carried for some time. "I am Margot Brunet," the woman said. "I knew Henrik Vorn. He helped us build the bakehouse the winter after the company left. He was here for a full season before he went south. I did not know he was gone for good until a year had passed, and no letter came." She looked at Rose for another moment, then she stepped aside. "Come in out of the cold," she said. "You will eat with us." The people of Pinecroft Station were the remnant of the original mill workforce. French-Canadian families from the Laurentians, a handful of Scottish settlers who had followed the logging north, and 3 Ojibwe families whose traplines ran through the same bush, and who had been drawn gradually into the settlement as the years passed and trust was slowly built. When the company went bankrupt and the superintendent locked the paymaster's box and departed south on the last working engine, these were the people left without wages, without transport, and without any official record of their presence, because the company had never properly filed the worker census it was legally required to submit. Rather than scatter, many of them had nowhere to scatter to. They had stayed. They pooled what remained. They cleared land. They sent word quietly to family in other areas, and a few more arrived over the years, people who were also done with depending on institutions that could simply disappear. They had removed themselves from the maps. Not out of spite, but out of a clear-eyed understanding that being unmapped was a form of protection against the kind of people who used maps to find things worth taking. They were not unwelcoming. They were careful, which is a different thing. Margot Brunet's husband, Yves Brunet, had been the settlement's blacksmith before he died the previous winter. His forge still stood, maintained now by his son, Théodore Brunet, 21 years old, broad-shouldered, competent, and quietly carrying his grief the way young men of his disposition often do, by working without stopping. It was Théodore who asked, on Rose's second visit, whether she had actually measured the creek fall herself, or was going on Vorn's notes alone. She told him she had done both, and she showed him the measurements in her notebook, alongside the original drawing. He studied them for a considerable time. Then he said that his father had talked, sometimes, about what it would mean if the mill could run again. Even a small operation. Even enough to run a grinding wheel and a small saw. They had always had enough water, he said. What they had never had was the knowledge of how to use it properly, or the materials to begin. She had both, she said so plainly, and that was the beginning of the thing. The wheel was built over 6 weeks, with Théodore Brunet doing the ironwork. The shaft couplings, the bearing housings, the gear teeth, in his father's forge, and Rose doing the carpentry on site, using the bevel gauge at every joint, every angle, every connection between wood and metal, where precision was the difference between a wheel that ran true and one that tore itself apart in a season. Margot Brunet came out to the mill site. On the morning, they were ready to set the wheel in place. She stood back with her arms folded while the two of them maneuvered the assembly into the housing on the bank. When the last pin was set and the sluice gate was drawn back, the water came through with a sound that surprised all three of them. A low, solid rush, like a long-held breath finally released, and the wheel began to move. It moved slowly at first, feeling the resistance, and then it found its pace and settled into a steady, heavy rotation that transmitted through the shaft and the gears to the small drive wheel above, turning with enough force to run a saw or a grinding wheel or a threshing drum. For a long moment, no one said anything. Théodore Brunet looked at Rose. She looked at him. Then Margot Brunet unfolded her arms and said something in French that Rose did not entirely catch, but which had the sound of a long overdue account being settled. Over the months that followed, Rose became what the settlement needed and had never had, a connection to the outside world that it could trust. She arranged to keep a horse at Saul Parr's livery in exchange for intelligence she gathered on her supply runs into Wharton. She brought back what the settlement needed: salt, lamp oil, medicine, hardware. And she began, carefully and discreetly, to trade what the settlement had to offer: preserved goods, smoked fish, worked leather, Théodore Brunet's ironwork, which was better than anything available from the town smithy, and priced Accordingly, once she had arranged the first sale through a general merchant, who did not ask too many questions about where the goods originated, she finished the millwright station into a proper home through that first summer. She dug out the floor and laid new timber planking. She chinked the walls and added a window on the south side for light. Henrik Vorn's drawing, wrinkled from having been unrolled and re-rolled 100 times. She Theodore frame behind glass, and it hung on the wall beside the window where the morning light caught it. And on the shelf beside that window, in the evenings when the kerosene lamp pushed the shadows back and the cast-iron stove held the cold at arm's length, two small objects sat side by side. One was her father's bevel gauge, its brass worn bright from 30 years of Ellis Keel's hands and then from her own. The other was the frame holding Henrik Vorn's wheel drawing, the careful lines of a machine designed for a creak that had already moved by the time he finished drawing it, designed in the patient faith that someone would eventually come, would read the new channel the way he had read it, and would understand what could be done. Two men, neither of them there, both of them in their different ways, trusting in a future they could not see and would not be present for. Rosamund Keel was 22 years old when Rufus Drace handed her an envelope, and, without intending to, handed her a life. He had seen only worthless land and a redundant girl. He had never learned his cousin's lesson. That true value is not always where the ledger says it should be, and that the places everyone agrees are worthless have a way of telling their stories to the people who bother to listen. The Pinecroft Spur had not led nowhere. It had led to an unmapped valley, a turning wheel, a community that had survived by choosing to be invisible, and a young woman who had spent her whole life learning to find true angles in the dark. She had started with $94, a bevel gauge, and a piece of land every sensible person had already decided was not worth the ink it took to file it. It was, as it turned out, exactly enough to begin. We'll leave you with a question tonight, if you're willing to sit with it a moment. Think of something in your own life that was dismissed, a path no one believed in, a direction that everyone agreed led nowhere. What did you find when you followed it anyway? Leave us a comment. We read everyone. And if tonight's story found you at the right moment, well, that's exactly what we were hoping for. Good night from Cabin Stories.